Welcome back, friends. I'm Annabelle, and I am here to read. Every week, first we read a piece of classic literature together, and then we talk about it. If you would like to follow along, down in the video description box there is a copy of a free ebook, along with some source links and a link to the author's biography. While you're walking around down there, there is a link to subscribe. It's very convenient. This week we are reading A Love Knot by W. Jacobs. Mr. Nathaniel Clark and Mrs. Bowman had just finished their third game of drafts. It had been a difficult game for Mr. Clark, the lady's mind having been so occupied with other matters that he had had great difficulty in losing. Indeed, it was only by pushing an occasional piece of his own off the board that he had succeeded. "A penny for your thoughts, Amelia," he said at last. Mrs. Bowman smiled faintly. "They were far away," she confessed. Mr. Clark assumed an expression of great solemnity. Allusions of this kind to the late Mr. Bowman were only too frequent. He was fortunate when they did not grow into reminiscences of a career too blameless for successful imitation. "I suppose," said the widow slowly, "I suppose I ought to tell you. I've had a letter." Mr. Clark's face relaxed. "It took me back to the old scenes," continued Mrs. Bowman dreamily. "I have never kept anything back from you, Nathaniel. I told you all about the first man I thought anything of, Charlie Tucker." Mr. Clark cleared his throat. "You did," he said, a trifle hoarsely. "More than once." "I've just had a letter from him," said Mrs. Bowman, simpering. "Fancy, after all these years. Poor fellow, he has only just heard of my husband's death, and by the way he writes—" She broke off and drummed nervously on the table. "He hasn't heard about me, you mean?" said Mr. Clark, after waiting to give her time to finish. "How should he?" said the widow. "If he heard one thing, he might have heard the other," retorted Mr. Clark. "Better write and tell him. Tell him that in 6 weeks' time you'll be Mrs. Clark. Then perhaps he won't write again." Mrs. Bowman sighed. "I thought, after all these years, that he must be dead," she said slowly, "or else married. But he says in his letter that he has kept single for my sake all these years." "Well, he'll be able to go on doing it," said Mr. Clark. "It'll come easy to him after so much practice." He says in his letter that he is coming to see me," said the widow in a low voice. To this evening." "Coming to see you?" repeated Mr. Clark sharply. "What for?" "Talk over old times, he says," was the reply. "I expect he has altered a great deal. He was a fine-looking fellow, and so dashing. After I gave him up, he didn't care what he did. Last I heard of him, he had gone abroad." Mr. Clark muttered something under his breath, and, in a mechanical fashion, began to build little castles with the drafts. He was just about to add to an already swaying structure when a thundering rat-tat-tat at the door dispersed the drafts to the 4 corners of the room. The servant opened the door, and the next moment ushered in Mrs. Bowman's visitor. A tall, good-looking man in a frock coat, with a huge spray of mignonette in his buttonhole, met the critical gaze of Mr. Clark. He paused at the door and, striking an attitude, pronounced in tones of great amazement the Christian name of the lady of the house. "Mr. Tucker," said the widow, blushing. "The same girl," said the visitor, looking round wildly. "The same as the day she left me. Not a bit changed, not a hair different. He took her extended hand and, bending over it, kissed it respectfully. It's very strange to see you again, Mr. Tucker, said Mrs. Bowman, withdrawing her hand in some confusion. Mr. Tucker, said that gentleman reproachfully, it used to be Charlie. Mrs. Bowman blushed again, and, with a side glance to the frowning Mr. Clark, called her visitor's attention to him and introduced them. The gentleman shook hands stiffly. Any friend of yours is a friend of mine, said Mr. Tucker, with a patronizing air. How are you, sir? Mr. Clark replied that he was well, and, after some hesitation, that he hoped he was the same. Mr. Tucker took a chair and, leaning back, stroked his huge mustache and devoured the widow with his eyes. Fancy seeing you again, said the latter in some embarrassment. How did you find me out? It's a long story, replied the visitor, but I always had the idea that we should meet again. Your photograph has been with me all over the world. In the backwoods of Canada and the bush of Australia, it has been my one comfort and guiding star. If ever I was tempted to do wrong, I used to take your photograph out and look at it. Suppose you took it out pretty often, said Mr. Clark restlessly. To look at, I mean, he added hastily, as Mrs. Bowman gave him an indignant glance. Every day, said the visitor solemnly. Once, when I injured myself out hunting, and it was 5 days without food or drink, it was the only thing that kept me alive. Mr. Clark's jibe as to the size of the photograph was lost in Mrs. Bowman's exclamations of pity. I once lived on 2 ounces of gruel and a cup of milk a day for 10 days, he said, trying to catch the widow's eye. After the 10 days, when the Indians found me, I was delirious, continued Mr. Tucker, in a hushed voice. And when I came to my senses, I found that they were calling me Amelia. Mr. Clark attempted to relieve the situation by a jocose inquiry as to whether he was wearing a mustache at the time, but Mrs. Bowman frowned him down. He began to whistle under his breath, and Mrs. Bowman promptly said, Hush. But how did you discover me? She inquired, turning again to the visitor. Wandering over the world, continued Mr. Tucker. Here today and there tomorrow, and unable to settle down anywhere, I returned to Northtown about 2 years ago. 3 days since, in a tram car, I heard your name mentioned. I pricked up my ears and listened. When I heard that you were free, I could hardly contain myself. I got into conversation with the lady and obtained your address, and after traveling 14 hours, here I am. How very extraordinary, said the widow. I wonder who it could have been. Did she mention her name? Mr. Tucker shook his head. Inquiries as to the lady's appearance, age, and dress alike were fruitless. There was a mist before my eyes, he explained. I couldn't realize it. I couldn't believe in my good fortune. I can't think, began Mrs. Bowman. What does it matter? Inquired Tucker softly. Here we are together again, with life all before us and the misunderstandings of long ago all forgotten. Mr. Clark cleared his throat preparatory to speech, but a peremptory glance from Mrs. Bowman restrained him. I thought you were dead, she said, turning to the smiling Mr. Tucker. I never dreamed of seeing you again. Nobody would, chimed in Mr. Clark. When do you go back? Back? Said the visitor. Where? Australia, replied Mr. Clark, with a glance of defiance at the widow. You must have been missed a great deal all this time. Mr. Tucker regarded him with a haughty stare. Then he bent toward Mrs. Bowman. Do you wish me to go back?" he asked, impressively. "We don't wish one way or the other," said Mr. Clark, before the widow could speak. "It don't matter to us." "We?" said Mr. Tucker, knitting his brows and gazing anxiously at Mrs. Bowman. "We? We are going to be married in 6 weeks' time," said Mr. Clark. Mr. Tucker looked from one to the other in silent misery. Then, shielding his eyes with his hand, he averted his head. Mrs. Bowman, with her hands folded in her lap, regarded him with anxious solicitude. "I thought perhaps you ought to know," said Mr. Clark. Mr. Tucker sat bolt upright and gazed at him fixedly. "I wish you joy," he said, in a hollow voice. "Thank ye," said Mr. Clark. "We expect to be pretty happy." He smiled at Mrs. Bowman, but she made no response. Her looks wandered from one to the other, from the good-looking, interesting companion of her youth to the short, prosaic little man who was exulting only too plainly in his discomfiture. Mr. Tucker rose with a sigh. "Goodbye," he said, extending his hand. "You are not going yet," said the widow. Mr. Tucker's low-breathed, "I must," was just audible. The widow renewed her expostulations. "Perhaps he's got a train to catch," said the thoughtful Mr. Clark. "No, sir," said Mr. Tucker. "As a matter of fact, I had taken a room at the George Hotel for a week, but I suppose I had better get back home again." "No, why should you?" said Mrs. Bowman, with a rebellious glance at Mr. Clark. "Stay and come in and see me sometimes and talk over old times. And Mr. Clark will be glad to see you, I'm sure, won't you, Mr. Clark?" "I shall be delighted," said Mr. Clark, staring hard at the mantelpiece. "Delighted." Mr. Tucker thanked them both, and after groping for some time for the hand of Mr. Clark, who was still intent upon the mantelpiece, pressed it warmly and withdrew. Mrs. Bowman saw him to the door, and with a low-voiced colloquy in which Mr. Clark caught the word "afternoon," ensued. By the time the widow returned to the room, he was busy building with the drafts again. Mr. Tucker came the next day at 3:00, and the day after at 2. On the third morning he took Mrs. Bowman out for a walk, airily explaining to Mr. Clark, who met them on the way, that they had come out to call for him. The day after, when Mr. Clark met them returning from a walk, he was assured that his silence of the day before was understood to indicate a distaste for exercise. "And you see, I like a long walk," said Mrs. Bowman, "and you are not what I should call a good walker." "You never used to complain," said Mr. Clark. "In fact, it was generally you that used to suggest turning back." "She wants to be amused as well," remarked Mr. Tucker. "Then she doesn't feel the fatigue." Mr. Clark glared at him, and then shortly, declining Mrs. Bowman's invitation to accompany them home on the ground that he required exercise, proceeded on his way. He carried himself so stiffly and his manner was so fierce that a well-meaning neighbor who had crossed the road to join him and offer a little sympathy if occasion offered, talked of the weather for 5 minutes and inconsequently faded away at a corner. Trimington as a whole watched the affair with amusement, although Mr. Clark's friends adopted an inflection of voice in speaking to him which reminded him strongly of funerals. Mr. Tucker's week was up, but the landlord of the George was responsible for the statement that he had postponed his departure indefinitely. Matters being in this state, Mr. Clark went round to the widow's one evening with the air of a man who has made up his mind to decisive action. He entered the room with a bounce, and, hardly deigning to notice the greeting of Mr. Tucker, planted himself in a chair and surveyed him grimly. "I thought I should find you here," he remarked. Well, I always am here, ain't I? Retorted Mr. Tucker, removing his cigar and regarding him with mild surprise. Mr. Tucker is my friend, interposed Mrs. Bowman. I am the only friend he's got in Trimington. It's natural he should be here. Mr. Clark quailed at her glance. People are beginning to talk, he muttered feebly. Talk? Said the widow, with an air of mystification belied by her color. What about? Mr. Clark quailed again. About our wedding, he stammered. Mr. Tucker and the widow exchanged glances. Then the former took his cigar from his mouth and, with a hopeless gesture, threw it into the grate. There's plenty of time to talk about that, said Mrs. Bowman, after a pause. Time is going, remarked Mr. Clark. I was thinking if it was agreeable to you of putting the banns up tomorrow. There's no hurry, was the reply. Marry in haste, repent at leisure, quoted Mr. Tucker, gravely. Don't you want me to put them up? Demanded Mr. Clark, turning to Mrs. Bowman. There's no hurry, said Mrs. Bowman again. I want time to think. Mr. Clark rose and stood over her, and after a vain attempt to meet his gaze, she looked down at the carpet. I understand, he said loftily. I'm not blind. It isn't my fault, murmured the widow, drawing patterns with her toe on the carpet. One can't help their feelings. Mr. Clark gave a short, hard laugh. What about my feelings? He said severely. What about the life you've spoiled? I couldn't have believed it of you. I'm sure I'm very sorry, murmured Mrs. Bowman. And anything that I can do, I will. I never expected to see Charles again, and it was so sudden, it took me unawares. I hope we shall still be friends. Friends? Exclaimed Mr. Clark, with extraordinary vigor. With him? He folded his arms and regarded the pair with a bitter smile. Mrs. Bowman, quite unable to meet his eyes, still gazed intently at the floor. You have made me the laughing-stock of Trimington, pursued Mr. Clark. You have wounded me in my tenderest feelings. You have destroyed my faith in women. I shall never be the same man again. I hope you will never find out what a terrible mistake you've made. Mrs. Bowman made a noise halfway between a sniff and a sob. Mr. Tucker's sniff was unmistakable. I will return your presents tomorrow, said Mr. Clark, rising. Goodbye, forever. He paused at the door, but Mrs. Bowman did not look up. A second later, the front door closed, and she heard him walk rapidly away. For some time after his departure, she preserved a silence which Mr. Tucker endeavored in vain to break. He took a chair by her side, and at the third attempt managed to gain possession of her hand. I deserved all he said, she cried at last. Poor fellow, I hope he will do nothing desperate. Oh, no, said Tucker, soothingly. His eyes were quite wild, continued the widow. If anything happens to him, I shall never forgive myself. I have spoiled his life. Mr. Tucker pressed her hand and spoke of the well-known refining influence a hopeless passion for a good woman has on a man. He cited his own case as an example. Disappointment spoiled my life so far as worldly success goes, he said softly. But no doubt the discipline was good for me. Mrs. Bowman smiled faintly and began to be a little comforted. Conversation shifted from the future of Mr. Clark to the past of Mr. Tucker, the widow's curiosity as to the extent of the latter's worldly successes remaining unanswered by reason of Mr. Tucker's sudden remembrance of a bear fight. Their future was discussed after supper, and the advisability of leaving Trimington considered at some length. The towns and villages of England were at their disposal, Mr. Tucker's business, it appeared, being independent of place. He drew a picture of life in a bungalow, with modern improvements at some seaside town, and the cloth having been removed, took out his pocketbook, and extracting an old envelope, drew plans on the back. It was a delightful pastime, and made Mrs. Bowman feel that she was 20 and beginning life again. She toyed with the pocketbook and complimented Mr. Tucker on his skill as a draftsman. A letter or two fell out, and she replaced them. Then a small newspaper cutting which had fluttered out with them met her eye. "A little veranda with roses climbing up it," murmured Mr. Tucker, still drawing, "and a couple of—" His pencil was arrested by an odd, gasping noise from the widow. He looked up and saw her sitting stiffly in her chair. Her face seemed to have swollen and to be colored in patches. Her eyes were round and amazed. "Aren't you well?" he inquired, rising in disorder. Mrs. Bowman opened her lips, but no sound came from them. Then she gave a long, shivering sigh. "Heat of the room too much for you?" inquired the other, anxiously. Mrs. Bowman took another long, shivering breath. Still incapable of speech, she took the slip of paper in her trembling fingers, and an involuntary exclamation of dismay broke from Mr. Tucker. She dabbed fiercely at her burning eyes with her handkerchief, and read it again. "Tucker. If this should meet the eye of Charles Tucker, who knew Amelia Wyborn 25 years ago, he will hear of something greatly to his advantage by communicating with N.C., Royal Hotel, Northtown." Mrs. Bowman found speech at last. "N.C. Nathaniel Clark," she said, in broken tones. "So that is where he went last month. What a fool I've been! What a simple fool!" Mr. Tucker gave a depreciatory cough. I had forgotten that was there," he said, nervously. "Yes," breathed the widow, "I can quite believe that." "I was going to show you later on," declared the other, regarding her carefully. "I was. Really, I couldn't bear the idea of keeping a secret from you long." Mrs. Bowman smiled. A terrible smile. "The audacity of that man," she broke out, "to stand there and lecture me on my behavior, to talk about his spoilt life, and all the time—" She got up and walked about the room, angrily brushing aside the proffered attentions of Mr. Tucker. "Laughing stock of Trimington, is he?" she stormed. "He shall be more than that before I am done with him. The wickedness of the man, the artfulness!" "That's what I thought," said Mr. Tucker, shaking his head. "You're as bad," said the widow, turning on him fiercely. "All the time you two men were talking at each other, you were laughing at your sleeves at me. And I sat there like a child, taking it all in. I've no doubt you met every night and arranged what you were to do the next day." Mr. Tucker's lips twitched. "I would do more than that to win you, Amelia," he said, feebly. "You'll have to," was the grim reply. "Now I want to hear all about this from the beginning. And don't keep anything from me, or it'll be the worse for you." She sat down again and motioned him to proceed. "When I saw the advertisement in the Northtown Chronicle," began Mr. Tucker in husky voice. I danced with joy. Never mind about that, interrupted the widow dryly. I went to the hotel and saw Mr. Clark, resumed Mr. Tucker, somewhat crestfallen. When I heard that you were a widow, all the old times came back to me again. The years fell from me like a mantle. Once again I saw myself walking with you over the footpath to Cooper's farm. Once again I felt your hand in mine. Your voice sounded in my ears. You saw Mr. Clark? The widow reminded him. He had heard all about our early love from you, said Mr. Tucker, and as a last desperate chance for freedom, he had come down to try to hunt me up and induce me to take you off his hands. Mrs. Bowman uttered a smothered exclamation. He tempted me for 2 days, said Mr. Tucker gravely. The temptation was too great, and I fell. Besides that, I wanted to rescue you from the clutches of such a man. Why didn't he just tell me himself? Inquired the widow. Just what I asked him, said the other. But he said that you were much too fond of him to give him up. He is not worthy of you, Amelia. He is fickle. He has got his eye on another lady. What? Said the widow with sudden loudness. Mr. Tucker nodded mournfully. Miss Hackbutt, he said, slowly. I saw her the other day, and what he can see in her I can't think. Miss Hackbutt? Repeated the widow in a smothered voice. Miss! She got up and began to pace the room again. He must be blind, said Mr. Tucker, positively. Mrs. Bowman stopped suddenly and stood regarding him. There was a light in her eye which made him feel anything but comfortable. He was glad when she transferred her gaze to the clock. She looked at it so long, he murmured something about going. Goodbye, she said. Mr. Tucker began to repeat his excuses, but she interrupted him. Not now, she said decidedly. I am tired. Good night. Mr. Tucker pressed her hand. Good night, he said tenderly. I am afraid the excitement has been too much for you. May I come round at the usual time tomorrow? Yes, said the widow. She took the advertisement from the table and, folding it carefully, placed it in her purse. Mr. Tucker withdrew as she looked up. He walked back to the George deep in thought, and over a couple of pipes in bed thought over the events of the evening. He fell asleep at last, and dreamed that he and Miss Hackbutt were being united in the bonds of holy matrimony by the Reverend Nathaniel Clark. The vague misgivings of the previous night disappeared in the morning sunshine. He shaved carefully and spent some time in the selection of a tie. Over an excellent breakfast, he arranged further explanations and excuses for the appeasement of Mrs. Bowman. He was still engaged on the task when he started to call on her. Halfway to the house, he arrived at the conclusion that he was looking too cheerful. His face took on an expression of deep seriousness, only to give way the next moment to one of blankest amazement. In front of him, and approaching with faltering steps, was Mr. Clark, and leaning trustfully on his arm the comfortable figure of Mrs. Bowman. Her brow was unruffled, and her lips smiling. Beautiful morning, she said, pleasantly, as they met. Lovely, murmured the wondering Tucker, trying, but in vain, to catch the eye of Mr. Clark. I have been paying an early visit, said the widow, still smiling. I surprised you, didn't I, Nathaniel? You did, said Mr. Clark in an unearthly voice. We got to talking last night, continued the widow, and Nathaniel started pleading with me to give him another chance. I suppose that I am soft-hearted, but he was so miserable. You were never so miserable in your life before, were you, Nathaniel? Never, said Mr. Clark in the same strange voice. "He was so wretched that at last I gave way," said Mrs. Bowman with a simper. "Poor fellow, it was such a shock to him, he hasn't got his cheerfulness back yet." Mr. Tucker said, "Indeed." "He'll be all right soon," said Mrs. Bowman in confidential tones. "We are on our way to put our banns up, and once that is done, he will feel safe. You are not really afraid of losing me again, are you, Nathaniel?" Mr. Clark shook his head, and meeting the eye of Mr. Tucker in the process, favored him with a glance of such utter venom that the latter was almost startled. "Goodbye, Mr. Tucker," said the widow, holding out her hand. "Nathaniel did think of inviting you to come to my wedding, but perhaps it is best not. However, if I alter my mind, I will get him to advertise for you again. Goodbye." She placed her arm in Mr. Clark's again and led him slowly away. Mr. Tucker stood watching them for some time, and then, with a glance in the direction of the George, where he had left a very small portmanteau, he did a hasty sum in comparative values and made his way to the railway station. The end. A Love Knot was initially published in 1906 in Strand magazine, which featured a lot of stories by W. Jacobs. It was kind of, at the time, the premier, mystery horror stories. That's where a lot of the Sherlock Holmes stories were initially published, was in Strand magazine. And it's kind of funny because this is sort of kind of like a love triangle story, but it also kind of reads like a horror story in some aspects because of all the twists in it. And especially to me, the denouement where they find each other on the road and Clark is with Mrs. Bowman and Tucker's there too, and it very much reads to me like Mrs. Bowman is, the killer and taunting the cop, and here's the victim, and it just very much reads to me like a horror story. In W. Jacobs, a lot of his writing is mystery stories. His most famous is A Monkey's Paw.
I wish for world peace.
Which isn't a mystery, it's a horror story. Those two are jammed together so much, it's fine, it works. And in the horror story, mystery story vein, I also found myself wondering throughout, why is Mrs. Bowman a widow? Not that widows are necessarily instantly suspicious, but now that we know the rest of the story, I'm a little suspicious. The things that struck me in this particular case as a performer, I edited this one a lot differently. Because the grandeur of the things that Mr. Tucker is saying, like, I was lost in the outback, and there were lions, and I fist fought a bear, and like, just all this crazy stuff that he's saying is just like this very grandiose. And Mrs. Bowman initially is, oh my! The things that Mr. Tucker is saying are so grandiose and like self-congratulatory that it is hilarious, and Mr. Clark clearly sees right through him the entire time, and Mrs. Bowman has no idea. And these three characters are really, really fun characters to do in the camera. And also I love the title, The Love Knot, because when you see it, it's love, K-N-O-T, and then as you go through, it's like, no, it's a pun. It's really, nobody here loves each other. This is just such a mess, but it's such a tangled mess that it is now a knot. And that's one of my favorite puns, is not and not. Especially in this particular context, because, it starts off with, oh, we're gonna go get married, it's gonna be so nice, and, the English idiom, tying the knot. So you think, from the outset, you're like, oh, they're gonna get married, it's gonna be so nice. And then it just kind of devolves. It'll be February by the time this is published, so I wanted to do a few, love stories, because, February, Valentine's Day, love, it's great, it's timely. This is clearly not a feel-good love story, but in order to find love stories, you have to kind of like, help me here, Google, what's a story that has love in it, you know? And there's some that I kind of passed over, and then I saw this one. It's called A Love Knot. All right. I love a story with a twist. I love a pun, and this has all of that. If you, like me, love puns and horror stories that aren't really horror stories, please leave a link down below so that I know you like it, and more importantly, YouTube knows that you like it, so you get more stuff like this. And I hope that I will see you next week for more. My outros are so bad. I need to come up with a bit or something. Oh my god.